I think if everyone can find a seat, we'll get started. I want to thank you for coming to the first Sweet Thursday of 2023. And weren't we lucky with the weather? So thank you for coming out. We're going to have a wonderful evening. But before we get started, I just want to make a few announcements and remind you that this program is brought to you by the Friends of the Library. And we raise money by selling gently used books at our bookstore, which is down on the lower level. How many of you have been to the bookstore? Okay. So I was just looking today at reading something. We have 20,000 books there. And we also have it online now. So if you are looking for a book, you can go in and ask somebody to look up and see if we have it, which is a huge help. So please do go there, because with the money we raise, we support the programs like this and the wonderful Wonders of the World WOW program. And we also support a lot of other programs here at the library and the collections in the library. So we're a very important partner with the foundation and the county and the city in making this library what it is. So we have a lot of programs coming up I want to mention, or a few I want to mention. We have an author named Karen Fowler coming on February 7th, who has written a book called Booth, and it's about the John Wilkes Booth family. So the whole family is interesting. It isn't just John Wilkes Booth himself, but she writes about the entire family. That's February 7th. On February 8th, we have our next WOW, Wonders of the World Museum program on Wednesday afternoons. This one will be about John Singer Sargent and his time in Spain and his paintings in Spain. And it's at the Legion of Honor, the exhibit, but we'll have a docent talking to us about it. Then on February 16th, I have to remember, I will be interviewing an author named C.W. Gortner, and he's known for writing biographical novels about famous people. And this one is about Jenny Jerome, who was Winston Churchill's mother. And it's called American Adventuress. And she was a fascinating woman. And that will be, unfortunately, a Zoom-only Sweet Thursday, because the author, after we booked him, moved to New York. So he can't come easily to us here. So those are our upcoming programs. But tonight we have something really exciting. I love such a good crowd. I hope a lot of you are interested in distilled spirits, because we're going to learn a lot about them. So this book, Doctors and Distillers. Fortunately, we have a doctor on our own Sweet Thursday team who is going to do the interviewing. And so I will introduce Jeff Deaton, doctor, who will come up and introduce the speaker and talk to you about Doctors and Distillers. So Jeff Deaton of Sweet Thursday.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. My doctoring had nothing to do with any of this. Tonight we have Camper English, a journalist based in San Francisco covering cocktails and spirits. He blogs in the site Academics and has written for a number of publications, including Sunset, The Chronicle, and Vibe, and others. He's been a guest speaker in many places, a competition judge, and a brand consultant, and he's gotten a bunch of awards. This is his first book. So please welcome Camper English. Some of these folks have already had a cocktail or two.
Oh,
It's a very enthusiastic crowd.
they only gave us a glass of vodka each. So.
I asked for gin.
Smart man.
Well,
Can you hear us with these remote mics? Are they working? A little closer. How about now? Hello. Is that more amplified? I can, yeah. Right.
welcome and thanks for coming. I thought I knew a little bit about alcoholic beverages, but I didn't. I learned so much reading this book, and there's so many crazy stories, and hopefully we'll get to some of them. first, I just have a little intro. Malaria, scurvy, cholera, bubonic plague, smallpox, yellow fever, slavery, and every beverage from beer to absinthe to quinine tonic water to chartreuse. History, alchemy, microbiology, epidemiology, physiology, and infectious disease. It's all here and more. This book is so comprehensive and so dense and so deeply researched. It's just an amazing thing. And so I want to start off with, I went through it and I thought, how am I going to start with the questions? Because it's so comprehensive. I thought, and then went back to the preface. And so I can either read it or you can read the first.
Oh, go for it.
Okay. This goes a little long. You can cut me off. Consider the Negroni. The bittersweet cocktail dating to the early 1900s is made of equal parts gin, sweet vermouth, and Campari. Gin takes its name and flavor from a berry-shaped cone of a tree once used to ward off bubonic plague. Vermouth comes from the German word for wormwood, famous for its ability to rid the body of intestinal parasites. Campari is a brand of liqueur dating to 1860 with a secret recipe probably containing gentian, proven effective against indigestion, and rhubarb root used in traditional Chinese medicine as a laxative, and until recently colored red with, I'm not sure the pronunciation of cochineal.
Cochineal? That's how
Cochineal insects, once thought to cure depression. The cocktail is often consumed as an aperitif, specifically to stimulate the appetite in preparation for a meal. Anyway, I won't read the whole deal because it'll take too long, but it's just, the idea is that you cover all these different aspects of drinks, which originated medicinally and only later became recreational.
Yeah, it really turns out that pretty much every ingredient down to the sugar and this fizzy water in any cocktail you can name was used as medicine at some point in time in some part of the world. And it was a lot more than I expected when I started doing the research. I didn't realize, like, specifically for fizzy water, how much of medical science and the understanding of gas laws and the germ theory of disease is about looking at fizzy water and fizzy beer, things like that. So it was, it's amazing that I can pretty much take everything in every cocktail and find out how it was used as medicine.
And we'll get to some of that. As I said at dinner, I thought this would serve as a great text for a college level course, whether it resided, I'm serious, it would be a popular one,
Yeah.
but it could reside in the Department of History or chemistry or biology or microbiology. And it would probably be one of those things like Jocks for Rocks at Cal back in the day, where the whole world would be there signing up. But my first questions are, and I can repeat these, there are three. How did you decide to write this? How did you do your research to accumulate all this information and then distill it, pun intended, down to the book? And then how do you sort through it all and choose your method of organization?
Small question. Okay.
I said I can repeat it, forget part of it.
Right. I will definitely forget even the second part by the time I've answered the first, which is how I decided to write it. One day I was writing a story on a trend in gin and tonics, the Spanish style of gin and tonics, which is typically served in a big goblet with great big ice cubes and with all sorts of garnishes. It's sort of like the Bloody Mary in America, and that there's like almost a competition to see how much garnish you can cram into one drink. And I was writing about that probably 5 years ago for a magazine, and went to look up what we thought of as the creation date for the gin and tonic. We'd always heard about when the gin and tonic was created, and I just went to confirm that, but there's no specific date. There wasn't anyway. And I thought, well, the history of cocktails is not very well documented because the drinking and the history of medicine tends to be very well documented. So I was like, I'm going to find the earliest creation date of the gin and tonic in a book on the history of malaria. So I started reading books on malaria. Turns out there are a lot of them. And I stupidly went from like earliest to most recent. Don't do your history research that way. Start with the most recent one and work backwards if you need to, it turns out. I found there wasn't a date. No one who writes about the history of malaria cares when the gin and tonic was created, it turns out. But I learned a lot about the history of disease and history of medicine and history of medicinal thought. Because malaria may have impacted the dinosaurs. It's that old of a disease. So that was fascinating. And I saw that alcohol touched the history of medicine and was intimately involved in the philosophy of medicine from its earliest days till relatively recently. So that's how the book came about, is that I was looking for one date and then found an entire, not really unsearched history needing to be told or anything. I think we all know a few things. We all know limes cure scurvy. You may know stuff about juniper. I guess that's not that common knowledge, and tonic water for malaria and things like that. But to put it together in one narrative was the opportunity and challenge that I took on with the book. So what was the second question?
Second one was, how did you do the research? So you
Yes.
mentioned one topic that you researched the wrong direction, but
Right.
how did that, what you just mentioned, lead to the rest of it?
For the most part, I kind of compartmentalized my research. I have a lot of liquor books at home and in my office. And so I went through all of those books to look for mentions of, bourbon was used against rattlesnake bites with American cowboys, and the history of gin and its use against bubonic plague and things like that. And then separately, I looked at the history of medicine and medical thought, as mentioned, but I got deep into it because there are certain eras that are very rich and unexplored, like how alchemy led to distilled spirits. No one was trying to make a drink when they distilled wine and got eau de vie. They were trying to capture the active essence of the wine itself and to create wine-based medicine. And it did, but they also got eau de vie out of it, which was great for everybody. And so I did the research by looking separately at the histories of medicine and the histories of specific alcohols, and dove into each of those where there was more material. As mentioned, the carbonation and gas law stuff I found to be super interesting and exciting for me personally to learn about, because it had an outdo influence on the history of medicine and medical understanding. And the third question is what I decided to put in
organize it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was really, I tried to largely avoid what we call traditional medicine, formerly known as folk medicine, in a lot of cultures in the world. There's a lot of examples we could use in that, but I didn't find that always correlates to medical thinking and the medical theory, which was interesting to track as it changed throughout the years. And so that's one thing I eliminated as much as possible to try to not have it be in the book, and to try to not use the same quotes that other people who have written similar on similar topics had used, but to plumb the depth of those original sources and find new materials that would reveal what people were thinking that led up to the famous quote that we may have heard before, like the dose makes the poison by Paracelsus. There's a huge history of what got to that thought, for example. So it was hard to stay on course, and I have documents and documents of all the stuff cut out of every chapter, which I thought would make good tweets, but I haven't done it yet.
Let's just do malaria in a little bit of depth. if that's okay, just as
Sure.
an example of a disease and the treatment. You mentioned in the book that a whole series of popes died of it in the 16th century. In the early to mid part of the 16th century, I don't think cause and effect, but the Jesuits ended up going to Peru. And from there, why don't you take the story?
From there, the Jesuit missionaries in Peru obviously were familiar with malarial fevers. Malaria comes from bad air, malaria, and was super big in Rome, and the Pontine marshes that famously surrounded Rome were swampy environments. But it was thought that it was kind of swamp gas, swampy air that caused malaria. They didn't figure out mosquitoes until almost 1900, like way later than you would guess. But so the symptoms of malaria are fever and ague, alternating fever and chills. In Peru, there was probably no malaria of the same sort in the Western Hemisphere in the early 1600s yet. And the Jesuit missionaries there learned from the indigenous people of a bark that people would take to calm the chills and fever associated with whatever they may have been suffering from there. But as diseases were more understood by their outward symptoms than the underlying causes, they said like, oh, hey, we know who's got fever, like all the popes and everybody in Rome. So let's send some bark back to Italy. Turns out, a great coincidence, that the bark that helps calm the fever and shaking actually helps prevent the propagation of a malarial parasite as it's in the blood, and essentially cures malaria and prevents it. So a great medical coincidence based on the outward symptoms. And that's almost like the start of the history of malaria. That's around 1630. It's associated for a while as being a Catholic cure, and the Protestants of Europe would rebel against this. Like, that's kind of witchcraft. We can't trust the Catholics, until a famous huckster pharmacist published his own cures. I've got the cure for you. Don't trust the Catholic stuff. Trust me. And his cure, he cured several members of royal families around Europe and sold it to one of the kings of France. On the condition that the recipe wasn't published till after his death. He died shortly thereafter. Turns out the recipe was this cinchona tree bark all along. He just covered it up with different flavorings and different formulations. After that point, everyone's on board, and then massive colonialism happens because people have access to the bark that's going to help prevent and cure malaria as they make inroads into Africa and India. And then eventually, as malaria comes into the Western Hemisphere, it was needed there as well. That's like 2/3 of malaria's story.
Well, and it's, cinchona, and it was anglicized or whatever it's quinine.
It's quinine is one of the active alkaloids in cinchona tree bark.
Right.
It was isolated, I think, around 1830 in France. And for a while, all of the trees, the cinchona trees, they're indigenous to the mountains in Peru and Bolivia, but a lot of countries were trying to smuggle seeds and trees out, which was forbidden by Peru and Bolivia because they were trying to protect their monopoly on that. And there's a whole era of like subterfuge of people trying to sneak out seeds, for which the penalty was death. That did happen. Eventually, seeds and trees were planted, particularly Java in Indonesia was one of the most important places, but also in India. And the global market for quinine shifted to the Dutch-controlled Indonesia, where almost all of the world's supply was now made. And at this point in the early 1800s, was able to be refined into quinine. And so kind of the rich countries of the world were able to take their quinine in the form of pills, and the poor people had Roundup bark to drink in a variety of beverages, which is how it fits in with the drinking part of the book, that we can find evidence of quinine bark or pills being consumed usually with sweetened beverages, but everything from sweet wines to beer to whiskey. In America, malaria was a big problem during the Civil War, to sherry, pretty much sweet pink lemonade for the people who built the Panama Canal was how people had their quinine, and all sorts of beverages. Eventually, the refined quinine gets put into pretty much any bitter alcohol made in the middle of the 1800s. If you think of any bitter liqueur like Campari or Aperol or these things that come out of Italy in the middle of the 1800s, those all have quinine in them, like kind of universally. It was like the electrolytes of the 1850s. Like, we don't know what it is or if it does anything, but just put it in there just in case. And so quinine was really just thrown into everything at the time. And many of those beverages still exist today in a very similar form to when they were directly medicine against fevers and cholera and malaria. So,
And there's other stuff. I mean,
and there's more.
we could, yeah, there's like the whole World War II aspect of it when Japan takes over the production in Java and Germany goes into Belgium.
Amsterdam, yeah.
And because the production facilities from the Belgian Congo and on and on. And I never knew why Fever Tree tonic was called Fever Tree, and now I do. So fascinating stuff, and it just keeps wrapping around. Well, let's do something different. Talk about chartreuse. The place, the order, the drink, and then last, the color.
Okay, so chartreuse, if you're not familiar with it, it is an herbal liqueur. Green chartreuse is the most famous, and there's also yellow chartreuse. If you know chartreuse by the word for the color, that word describes the color of the liqueur, not the other way around. So the color was named for this famous product. The product is today and has always been produced by the Carthusian monks in the mountains above Grenoble in France. In the era, if we look in the Middle Ages in Europe, the centers of knowledge were largely the monasteries. That's where people were literate. They passed books back and forth and transcribed them. They were the centers of medical knowledge. Most importantly, they had herb gardens and they had distilleries to make distilled medicine and often provided beneficial medicines for the surrounding communities. They're also the landlords, so it was an exchange, we could say. But many different monasteries produced medicines. Chartreuse would be one that was kind of a cure-all. There were specific things that it was recommended to treat, but it was almost like people would take it like a daily vitamin, and still do. Some older people in France put this liqueur on a little sugar cube and have one spoonful a day. It's adorable. But so the Carthusian monks originally in Paris were given as a gift an ancient recipe, and the year they were given this recipe was 1605. It's a piece of parchment that dated for many years before, and the monks worked on this recipe that was described in the document as being very superlative, good for all sorts of things, and they worked to improve it and added ingredients, and it got up to 130 ingredients, which is how it's still made today, the liqueur. And it was first given and then sold to surrounding communities, first in Paris, but really it was perfected in where the mother house of the Grand Chartreuse is today, where the monks are silent, I think, except for one day of the week. They prepare the herbs in secret rooms, and they bag it up and send it to the distillery, where it's a mix of lay people and the monks make it into its final formulation. And it's very special liqueur. If you've had it, you know, it's really high proof, first of all. So it has a kick, it has an impact. It's very spicy and gingery and minty, and it tastes like medicine. And so its path is clear. But to this day, I believe 3 monks know the recipe to the liqueur altogether, and it's highly secretive. And if you look through archives going back at least into the 1800s, you find it's always been this exalted liqueur made by the monks, the silent monks in the mountains of Chartreuse. So it's very special, and it was directly medicine. The original format is a little bottle, and it comes in a wooden container, which just came to America for the first time ever in the end of last year. But then there's the table liqueur version of it, which is the green chartreuse and yellow chartreuse that we know today. And they are in cocktails, including the Last Word is probably the most famous one that has chartreuse amongst its ingredients. So it's probably the most direct connection to medicine of a beverage going back to ancient times. It's still produced and probably very similar to its original form as medicine. And it tastes delicious.
You know, when I started reading this, I went to Jackson's across the street and specifically for this, and the gentleman said, we can't get it. The distributors can't get it. And so I don't know where one would.
There were supply chain
imbibe it
issues.
And do bars in the city have it?
Oh yeah, and you can, it's back a little bit more. Some of the supply chains have eased up, but it actually started selling much better during the pandemic to everyone's surprise. They had like laid off their brand ambassadors, so like, we're going quiet for a bit, but then they started selling it because I think people were getting into home mixology, and there's a lot of kind of iconic cocktails that use the iconic liqueur green chartreuse.
Somebody didn't tweet that it cures COVID.
Not that I saw. They did tweet about quinine and then later about wormwood, and my local herb and supply store actually put a limit on how much cinchona bark you could now buy in one order. And that had never been the case before, of people trying to self-medicate, probably to no positive effect.
But you point out that the color came last. You know, all this other stuff happened way before, and you know, now it's a recognized unique color. Just a little tidbit. You mentioned that all these spirits, or not all of them, but many throughout your book, you write that, oh, this was used to regulate body temperature, whether warm or cold. And is that, I mean, did you find the underlying theme with that? Is it just the alcohol part of it, or what? Or was it just a marketing gimmick?
No, I think that, I mean, inherently, many of us have had, hot toddy on some nights, or when we were feeling a cold, or used a drink to cool us down when we're hot, or to make you feel warm when you're cold, even though it's not really a great idea to say, hop off the Titanic and drink whiskey in the water. It's not bad for your overall body temperature, but it makes you feel good on the way down to the bottom of the ocean, I guess. So I found that when I looked at distilled spirits and how they were used, distilled spirits, we no longer think of them as regional, really, I don't think, but the spirits from grapes come from France and from Italy. Spirits from grain come from more northern countries. Rye whiskey in America is a more northern spirit, and bourbon whiskey is a more southern spirit. And things like aquavit grow where caraway is abundant. And there are a lot of regionalities in spirits and how they're created. And I found commonalities in how each of those spirits were used medicinally. Regulating body temperature is the top one. Like, oh, well, if you're in the Caribbean, you have to have rum. No one can tolerate the hot temperatures without some spirits. Similarly, in the North, like, well, no one could possibly tolerate the cold temperatures without some whiskey in their flask. And only one of those was sort of effective, but the commonality of how spirits were used in different places and times was very interesting. And some spirits would then take on their own reputations as being particularly good for treatment of one thing versus the other. Most of it probably not true, but what I learned writing the book was that brandy was always considered a reviver. It was something that if you fainted or something, quick, the brandy, and there were ads that say, the brandy quick, that was literally one. And like, fetch the brandy from the medicine cabinet to help so-and-so who has fainted. And going on that sort of mythology of brandy as a reviver, do you know about the St. Bernards with the barrels underneath their neck? They were supposed That was supposed to revive you.
Really blew me out.
Yeah, isn't this amazing? From being, you're caught in an avalanche or a snowstorm in the mountains of France, as we all have been. And Saint Bernard comes galloping to your rescue and have a barrel of brandy underneath their collar to help warm you up. Well, it turns out that that didn't happen. That there's a famous painting of a Saint Bernard coming to the rescue with a barrel of brandy around its neck, and it goes from basically one painting of someone who had never been to that part of the world. And I don't know if he'd ever seen a Saint Bernard, but the painting was pretty good. He probably had seen a Saint Bernard. Anyway, so that mythology spread from there, but it makes sense in the context of brandy is seen as something that revives one. It's pretty interesting.
Many times you talk about what various drinks were promoted as helping with. There's an incredible amount of overlap and redundancy, and a lot of these were purported to treat a million things, you know, dyspepsia, kidney stones, cough, you know, consumption,
Gout.
everything
was for gout.
Wouldn't people be a little more specific and imaginative? I mean, did you figure out why that was that, or is it just like, hey, it's medicine, it'll take care of all kinds of stuff?
I think it was numbing, and it was the main reason. Numbing and soothing. A lot of the things that alcohol cured, it really just soothed. Historically, when penicillin came along, it sort of eliminated the need for a lot of alcohol-based medicines that had been used to supposedly treat in the past with herbal medicine. And so a lot of alcohol gets credited with doing a whole bunch of stuff that it absolutely does not do. But for specific ailments, and particularly in the era of the patent medicine of the snake oils and cure-alls, there didn't used to be laws about false advertising or about listing ingredients on medicines in America. And you could advertise anything as containing anything and being good to treat anything, and people did. And so we saw bottles that would cure every disease known to humankind in the later 1800s. And really one of the most important laws ever passed in America, I would say, is the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And I think it's interesting about that is it covers food, and it covers medicine, and it covers alcohol, all as like a same grouping, and that they were used more or less interchangeably. Well, not interchangeably, but they're used in the same way. And we start to separate them in the public consciousness when we're looking at rules and regulations and government laws treating medicine differently from food and differently from alcohol. Whereas before, a lot of these patent medicines were 60% alcohol and then, you know, a cup of wormwood thrown in to supposedly cure something, but most were just an alcohol delivery mechanism.
You mentioned germ theory earlier. Pasteur studied fermentation and identified it as a bacterial process, not a chemical one. How did those experiments with beer and wine and yeast and bacteria change the understanding of disease at the time?
Well, before Pasteur, the reigning theory was of spontaneous generation, that if you leave soup out, the mold that grows on it just grew on it from nowhere, or that meat that would get maggots and flies on it, those came from nowhere specifically. What Pasteur realized early on when he was studying beer and wine, and this is like super nerdy and amazing, and Pasteur is a phenomenal thinker of his era. So if you look at carbonated water, fizzy water from naturally carbonated lakes, this is a chemical process happening underground with volcanic gases carbonating your water, and you get your Evian or your Perrier out of it at the end on the surface. And scientists were fascinated by this special mineral water, and fizzy mineral waters were thought to be the most healthy and medicinal of all the waters. And by studying that, they figured out that, oxygen and carbon dioxide and everything like that, the gas laws. Pasteur comes after this point, and he is looking at beer and wine, which is also fizzy, bubbly water with some similar aspects to the fizzy water and from fizzy beer. But he realizes by using new advanced microscopy that wine tartrates have molecular asymmetry, which he theorizes only comes from a biological process, and therefore cements his theory that fermentation of beer and wine is a biological and not a chemical process. This one kind of simple basic thought leads us to the germ theory of disease, that when beer and wine ferment and then later spoil, that those are biological processes happening. So he does his famous experiments where he puts fermentable substances and keeps out all the air in a glass container, and they never spoil. They don't produce mold. They don't have maggots flying around on them afterwards. And he essentially disproves spontaneous generation, which leads directly to the germ theory of disease. That diseases are caused by germs. They're not caused by swamp gas, by the miasma that was thought to be the route of disease transmission. It's a gas that surrounds us all that makes us all sick, rather than a germ passing from a person to a person. Huge move forward in medical thought, starting from beer and wine, looking at beer and wine directly. And who knows what might have happened if Pasteur was a shoemaker or something. We would have great shoes, for sure.
There's so many ways to go. I mean, there's the cocaine, he had a little bit on cocaine.
That's one way to go.
Coca-Cola. Okay,
I mean, it's a little late for that.
A drink with lithium, there's laudanum. I mean, there's all this stuff throughout time, and there's all this stuff's covered. Oh, by the way, even if you don't read the book, about every few pages, there's a drink recipe. So you've got, all the stuff, and I made a couple that I'd never made a sidecar before until a few nights ago, and I thought that's a really nice drink. Anyway, so it's a really good reference book, and I wanted to mention some of the weird names, but funny. A monkey gland, snake bite, probably blood and sand, corpse reviver, death in the afternoon, hanky panky, root of all evil, penicillin. Anyway, some of these, more than a few, have absinthe in them.
Yeah.
And so it's not too surprising. Why don't you tell the story of absinthe, or part of the story?
Sure. Well, absinthe is famously a spirit with wormwood in it. Most of the flavor of modern absinthe is anise, from fennel and anise and star aniseed and star anise, but its name comes from Artemisia absinthium, the Latin name for wormwood, for grand wormwood specifically, which is a super bitter plant. Wormwood's been used in wines and beers going back to at least the ancient Greeks. Probably before that, was always considered something that would help purge intestinal parasites, and whether it was effective for that or not. But as a bitter substance, it also helps stimulate the appetite. So our biology registers bitter flavors as being poisonous, and it's a warning symbol. And what happens biologically is we start salivating and our stomach juices start flowing. And that's not all about getting ready for a meal. That's like, get rid of this poison that you just put in your mouth. And if you have too much of a bitter something, then it comes out the other end faster than it would have. But we sort of hack our bitter plants that we eat to make them aperitifs and digestifs. Anyway, so absinthe in its modern form, distilled spirit, wormwood added, was created as medicine, probably on the Swiss-French border specifically. And then it was taken by the French army, who were then fighting in North Africa. And absinthe is traditionally very high proof, and it was used to, they thought it would combat malaria, probably not all that helpful for that, and also for waterborne diseases. They would add a splash of it to the water which would actually help kill some of the germs in it and make it safer to drink. French soldiers returned to Marseille and Paris in particular and start bringing their taste for absinthe back home. And it becomes a very big trend in Paris to be sitting at your cafe, having your glass of absinthe as an aperitif. And if you think about it, those anise flavors are pretty cooling, and there wasn't air conditioning at the time. And I think that's the whole reason for Paris cafe culture. Everyone drinking absinthe is just a naturally cooling nature of anise, which is something we don't typically think about. But anyway, absinthe really caught on. But what happened to make the absinthe craze an issue in France was phylloxera, which is a vine louse that essentially killed all of the vines in France and a lot of other countries in Europe. Wine, which was an everyday beverage, the average person drank a liter of wine a day in France, and then it was gone. And I say it's like imagining that Coca-Cola no longer existed, but there was unlimited Red Bull. It's like people would get kind of weird because it's stronger. And, you know, absinthe is 70% alcohol, wine 12%. There's a huge difference. Even though you're supposed to dilute absinthe, people didn't handle it well. And there were rumors of people essentially going crazy. And it did cause a lot of problems in society. But then when the wine industry got back on its feet, they were like, you know, absinthe is causing a lot of problems in society. You should probably go back to wine. And they essentially orchestrated a smear campaign against absinthe and saying that stuff is poison. Drink healthy, good for you wine. And they would hype up any problems with absinthe. And so though there were some problems with bad absinthe, the wine industry blamed it entirely on that. Absinthe became illegal around 1900, 1905 in several countries in the world, but not all of them. And so it wasn't really a problem. If we measure old absinthe with modern technology and look for the amount of thujone, which is a problematic chemical at high doses in absinthe and in wormwood, it's almost undetectable in old absinthe. So the wormwood was never really the problem. It was probably the 70% alcohol that was the problem.
So do you think the wine industry was behind the smear, or that man that killed his family and apparently led to the legislation against it?
Yeah, there's a famous case of a person who murdered their entire family after drinking absinthe. Apparently, absinthe was the first drink in the morning, and then he had about 30 other drinks throughout the day and then killed his family, but absinthe took the blame. So sensationalizes absinthe was the thing that caused this famous murder. And I don't know if the wine industry like had their hand in that specific promotion, but it was definitely suited their argument that you should drink wine instead.
You mentioned wormwood is bitter. Bitters are pretty prominent in a lot of these concoctions and in modern cocktails. Can you talk about some of those?
Sure. Well, today when we talk about bitters, and we're thinking largely of like Angostura bitters, which is the small bottle with the oversized label that people say, what lasts longer, your marriage or your bottle of Angostura bitters? A lot of people don't really use a lot of it. I go through gallons. It's different. I'm single. I don't know if that's related. Anywho, bitters were developed specifically as a stomach soothing medicine. They had lots of roots and barks in them, including quinine for fevers. And they were developed, Angostura comes actually from South America, but the original bitters that became famous were Stoughton's bitters from England, created at the end of the 1700s. It was just a little bit of bitter medicine that people might add a splash of to their beer or wine to soothe the stomach or take on their own. What happened in the creation of the original cocktail, the first definition of it we find in the early 1800s as being spirit, sugar, water, and bitters. It's vulgarly called the bittered sling, vulgarly meaning commonly called the bittered sling. Essentially, you took the way you drink whiskey by adding some sugar and water to it to make it easily to drink, and added stomach medicine to it. It's like, instead of cranberry juice in your Cosmo, adding Robitussin. That was like the mixology of the time. And the original cocktail was a morning drink. I found it's really hard to believe, but there's like undeniable evidence that the cocktail was absolutely a morning beverage. It predates ice in drinks. So the original recipe for a cocktail, spirit, sugar, water, bitters, not ice. By the time cocktail books come out in the 1860s, they specify ice that goes into the drink. So a room temperature glass of whiskey and sugar and water and stomach medicine that you drink first thing in the morning. Like that's mixology, folks. So that drink is the original cocktail. And then the cocktail today obviously means any kind of mixed drink, but that drink gets so many variations and, you know, mixology of the day of the 1800s. But by the end of the 1800s, old curmudgeonly drinkers who have always existed were specifying, like, I don't want your fancy cocktail with your orange slices in it. I want an old-fashioned cocktail like I used to drink. The original cocktail is the old fashioned as we know it today. It just has ice rather than water in it. But that is basic whiskey, sugar, water with a splash of medicine directly in the drink. It's pretty amazing. That's still like one of the most popular drinks in the world today, is a drink where you like just dosing your morning whiskey with some medicine.
But there are these botanicals, many of them bitter, also in these pre-made magical mixes, chartreuse being one of them, but also Campari and Aperol and others. And they remain incredibly popular.
They do. It's weird that we just sort of were like, you know, I like this
We've
medicine.
adapted to the bitter, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know really how much they've changed over time. Everyone claims to be the original recipe created by the one person in their spirits. And I think that's probably not 100% true, but yeah, that we're drinking things, many things that were directly created as medicine. Another study found that Campari, famous red liqueur in a Negroni, was based on the recipe for Stoughton bitters, sort of the original bitters that made their way into cocktails. And that correlation is pretty exciting to learn, because that's they didn't advertise themselves as being all that medicinal, but to learn that they based it on medicine is pretty amazing. But anything that's sort of a bitter liqueur that's Italian or maybe French herbal liqueur, those probably were created in a local area as like the city centers cure-all medicine, that maybe you would have a cafe as a digestif. Maybe you were feeling bad and had it. A lot of these were used until you could get to the doctor on Monday or something. So try to get you through the weekend. And now we get through the weekend with their help as well.
Throw a little aspirin. You have stuff on monks. You cover how slavery is part of the rum trade, an integral, basically, requirement. But those are long ones. Let's talk about corpse medicine.
Yeah, that's a whole thing. You wouldn't think, but people drank mummies. They drank a lot of mummies. They drank almost all of the mummies of ancient Egypt, which are used in medicine, so much that people started making fake mummies to sell to use in medicine because they ran out of the mummies that they could pilfer from Egyptian tombs. That's how much mummy medicine was consumed, and really it's a long period of a few hundred years, but like the heyday of it would be when we think of Egyptology in old British movies. It's sort of then obsession with Egypt, but also with mummies and mummy medicine. And it's all probably based on a mistranslation, which makes it all the more absurd. There was a tar pitch, sort of like asphalt, that was not commonly found on the surface as it isn't today, but that was used in medicine going back to the ancient Greeks. This pitch was used in embalming of mummies. And so later on, medicinal uses of mummies were to get the pitch out of them And then it became confused with the medicine is the flesh of the mummy later on. And so people began eating mummies, thinking that that was where the medicine was. And it was really in the tar that was in the mummies, which also probably didn't do a whole lot of good for anybody. But this incredibly long era of corpse medicine. It's not limited to mummies. Skull moss was a big one. You grow moss on a skull, and that's going to be good medicine. I don't think I ever figured out why. Like that was like, oh, that's the thing. You grow moss on a skull, and that's going to cure, I don't know what, but there's a lot of body parts used in medicine in the, let's say, 15 to 1700s. Gross. And then I put a corpse survivor recipe like in that section just for fun. Like no corpses were harmed in the making of corpse survivors.
So we learned about the origin of Listerine. I'm going to read a little passage here that kind of sums up part of this book. Much of the overlapping history of alcohol and medicine concerns the use of alcohol as medicine, but beer, wine, and fizzy spa water inspired great progress in medical science. By studying studying and replicating the natural processes of carbonation and fermentation, scientists began to understand the nature of gases and the existence of invisible microbes. These inspired new theories about the causes of diseases and methods to kill germs, sometimes using alcohol itself to do it. Along the way, we were rewarded with longer lasting beer and minty fresh breath. Anyway, I just love this. There's so much more stuff we could do, and the history part that goes back, Paracelsus and, O to B and all that. But it's getting up to close to 8. And so I think we should open it up to audience questions.
So amongst all your research, whether it is a book or not, how much do you find was actually, of these alcohol remedies actually had some medicinal proof to it versus the sort of legend, myth, the talk versus actual cure?
So the question was how many of these cures were valid, essentially. So many of them were valid only as soothing problems and not treating the underlying diseases, particularly anything that had an external aspect to the symptoms. There's a lot on syphilis in the book. We didn't even get into that. That's one that has a lot of external symptoms and a lot of really like not great medicines applied towards it. But overall, it's kind of hard to say, other than like there are herbs that soothe it and the alcohol that would soothe the issues. And I tend to be very much like, oh, science is the answer. But I forget that actually the tree from Peru and Bolivia prevents and cures malaria, which is disease not even indigenous to that continent. And like herbal medicines are valid. I have to remind myself they're absolutely important and did treat a lot of things, maybe less effectively than modern medicine, but certainly to some aspect. You can choose.
You do it. Andy?
You're all my favorites. I don't know. That's a very, it's traditional in cough medicine. And it's kind of hard to people like non-alcohol cough medicine seem to be a challenge for producers. And I actually don't know why that is.
It's solubility of some of this stuff.
It could be. Alcohol is very useful for in medicine is something that absorbs both flavors and the active compounds in medicinal botanicals. And it's still very useful for that. Herbal medicine is like step one, put your herb in alcohol. Alcohol is the easiest way to get the medicinal aspect out of most plants. And it's harder to do it without alcohol than it is with it. And that's something that people really, there's a big movement to get all alcohol out of medicine, more so today for people who don't want to have alcohol in their lives in any way, to be able to avoid that, which is, I think, a good thing. But it's great at taking out those active components as well as the flavors. That's why liqueurs are in alcohol, but also as a sanitizer is the other modern use of alcohol. Many of our favorite distilleries started making hand sanitizer during the pandemic to keep us all safe. Like it's not all bad, folks.
That could be dangerous, because then if you don't know whether you're dealing with isopropanol or ethanol and you drink the wrong one.
I was always like, it's like a really bad tequila on my hands today. Like, you're like, I think this was sugarcane derived. I'm like, too much of a nerd sometimes when you're like taste testing the hand sanitizer. It's like, not. I have terrible survival instincts. That's the lesson to take home
Yeah,
today.
your aversion to bitter is gone.
Right, yeah.
Anybody else? Sir?
I thought the gin and tonic originated with the East India Company in Madras, which is now Chennai, at the east coast of India.
Well, the first reference we find to it is in India, and it's definitely a drink that we first see to come together in India. The tonic was, the quinine was in a lot of different beverages and foods and consumed all over the world in liquid form. Where the gin and tonic get together, the first reference that we've been able to find is in the 1860s in India. And at that point, it's already kind of semi-recreational because the reference is at a horse race. We all retired from the race to have some gin and tonics. So it was sort of like the medicine you had to take while you were a British officer in India, and also becoming a recreational one that you would also take for its fun effect. But yeah, it's definitely something that we first see in India, but the gin and the tonic were available separately before we see them come together as a drink. And, you know, both of those, the purified quinine pills probably come from Britain or possibly from France, and the tonic water that comes from like the history of Schweppes. That's its own amazing history. And the carbonated water, but for them to come together in another country so very far away from ingredients that are indigenous to Peru on a completely different hemisphere it's amazing. The gin and tonic is a global drink and a global history. Just looking at one delicious beverage, of which I had a couple before coming to the seminar across the street. It helps for the talking. Yeah, so quinine, although the United States government disrecommends using quinine for nighttime leg cramps, that's their official policy. It is commonly used as herbal medicine for that. I feel like, so I don't know really the medical, I don't have the medical language to describe it, but I think it's something to do with a relaxation of muscles, similar to if you're having like chills from fever. It's all like if you think of that as sort of almost a cramping, like that's my non-scientific, non-official analysis of the commonality between muscle and leg cramps and the chills and fever.
Yeah, I don't know the physiology. In the back?
Purely based on history, that's unfair. I mean, purely based on history, I would choose the thing with the most medicine in it, I suppose, which could be a Negroni, as from what was read earlier, because we have 3 ingredients all with their own unique individual histories as medicine. I do like what I'm thinking about medicine, like I want a gin and tonic all the time. I like the drink in general. A very good tonic is important in the drink. That's the secret, is it's about the tonic, it's not about the gin. But I'll often have one of those when I'm like deep in research about medicine. That'll be my go-to.
Is gin and tonic the most popular cocktail around the world? There's number one.
We didn't even talk about Baijiu.
We didn't talk about Baijiu, which is the most popular spirit in the world, outselling the combination of vodka and whiskey and I believe rum all together. Like Baijiu is so So much of it is consumed in China and
Is there a lot of Chinese people?
there are.
And they all drink baijiu? Well,
They, and many people drink baijiu, which is a challenging spirit to get into, and I love it. It's like it's really funky and weird, and I learned all about it. I got to go to China, and so I'm obsessed. But as far as the most popular cocktails, there are surveys that come out every year, and it tends to be a margarita. It tends to land on the top. And I think that's due to all those Tex-Mex chain restaurants. They're selling a lot of margaritas specifically. That's also who they ask about what the most popular cocktails are. And I would say in like cocktail bars around the world right now, it's probably the old fashioned is once again, one of the top ones. The Negroni has come back into soaring popularity recently, and that I know is become more popular. And for home mixology, people are discovering the Negroni, so that's used there. And after that, I'm trying to think of what the second most popular one that makes those lists, and I'm sort of failing on it. But margarita usually.
so the
comes
old
down.
fashioned more than a Manhattan?
Yes. When classic cocktails came back, the Manhattan was sort of the king there, but now we've gone to the old fashioned.
Yeah.
In part because the ice is better now.
Don't get him going on.
Don't
ice.
get me going on ice. I'll come back for that.
Oh, wait.
Oh, my next project is a book about ice. It comes out in May, and it's like a how-to book on ice. It's a whole thing. Yeah. Yes, you need it. Because the ice is really, really, really good. You're like, how can it be that? It's trust me. Thanks.
Whoa.
This factory, and it is for health, it is for strength, it is for all this. I noticed up here in your title, the remarkable history of beer and wine. Can you comment a little bit on the control benefits here?
Certainly. Well, beer, when water was not safe to drink, which was throughout most of history, beer and wine were the beverage you would use as we would use water today. Usually a low in alcohol beer, and you would serve children beer as well. And that was usually sort of a second fermentation of the beer. And that would be something like 2% alcohol, very weak. But the process of making beer essentially sterilizes the water. So if we think of the people who built the pyramids, they drank beer, they didn't drink water. And there are documents of which type of worker gets how much beer per day. And at the time it was consumed, it was kind of not filtered well, so it was kind of chonky. And there were big pictures of big straws stuck into communal beer vessels, and that's how you would drink it, is to poke underneath like the layer of grains floating on the top of it. So throughout much of history, beer takes the role of water and hydration, specifically for workers, all the way into the Industrial Revolution. Many workers drank beer all the time. When that was replaced by tea, that was considered a big success because it was safe to drink, because it was boiled water, and it replaced beer. And so people wouldn't be quite as tipsy. But there are sort of rumors that beer was used to create a docile workforce, and it's just it was just to hydrate people. I don't think that was the nefarious reasons. Guinness specifically was associated with having high iron content, whether that's true or not. And it was sort of a traditional medicine, particularly in the UK. And all the way into the 1980s, breastfeeding mothers were told, drink Guinness. And if you gave blood, you were given a free pint of Guinness and to replace the iron in your blood. So any kind of fluids passing out of you, like Guinness was the answer for that. And the parent company officially parted ways with that messaging not that long ago, surprisingly.
That long ago.
When and where was that first cocktail created? Now, the first I was thinking that you mentioned was eau de vie. Where was your understanding of the very first distilled spirit?
So distilled spirits really specifically come out of alchemy in the process of making distilled medicines. Distilled non-alcoholic spirits actually predate the ones with alcohol, which is very interesting in our industry, where this new non-alcoholic spirits are a thing that everybody's like, that's not real, it doesn't have alcohol in it. But actually, historically, distilled non-alcoholic spirits were first. Anyway, alchemists are making distilled medicine. If you think of rose water, roses only last for so long, but if you toss it in some water and distill it, you get rose water, which is now preserved, and it's both aromatic and medicinal qualities are now preserved throughout the year. It was in the process of making medicines out of all sorts of botanicals that when the technology got good enough, that wine went into the still, and then they made heads and tails cuts to concentrate the wine into alcohol, that we find distilled spirits and people commenting on it. Roughly the year 1200, southern Italy in the medical school of Salerno. We know that the Islamic alchemists mentioned distilling wine, but they didn't seem to think it was interesting. So I think they distilled, say, red wine and just got white wine out of it because they didn't make any cuts. So the proof would be the same before and after. Whereas the Italians, they made those cuts and concentrated the alcohol and then reconcentrated, and they had names for burning water, flaming water, and then water of life. I always thought that was marketing, like calling distilled spirits water of life, but it was actually thought that this was the greatest medicine anyone has ever created. That's what, when the first person tasted brandy off the still, that's what they said. Like, we did it, bam, we cured death. We made eau de vie, and it catches on fire, but it doesn't burn anything. It perks you up. It gives you energy. It supposedly made the person on their deathbed say their last words. It's supposed to heal gout and kill lice. You can use it externally and internally. They really thought it was the greatest medicine ever created. And that name, eau de vie, aqua vitae, means the water of life. That gets translated in Gaelic as whiskaba, which becomes whiskey. Becomes aqua vitae becomes aquavit in Scandinavia. What the early days of distilled spirits were only about making medicines and not about creating beverages whatsoever. And it just so happened that we like drinking them and the effects that they give to us, whether we need that medicine or not.
Okay, last question.
We were talking about that at dinner, and it's sort of the philosophy towards addiction really changed a lot throughout historically and wasn't seen the way we see it today. But what I think is a few interesting points in history is during this absinthe craze and then during the gin craze, two big periods of both alcoholism, but just like overuse of alcohol by everybody. It was thought that the cure for alcoholism, which was considered drinking distilled spirits too much, was to drink beer and wine, and that would cure you. And so it was like, here is port to treat your alcoholism. It was really a division of how people saw beer and wine versus distilled spirits. And in American Prohibition, when those laws were being proposed, a lot of the brewers associations were pro-prohibition because they didn't realize that it was going to apply to them. And it was only when the Volstead Act was passed afterwards to say what is actually legally alcohol or not, that some people learned that, oh, beer is lumped in with that, and beer was out as well. So it's that was an earlier division. And then later on, I think a lot of it has to do with laws of, for example, when prohibition comes in and now all alcohol is bad and forbidden, that there becomes different visions of alcohol as a general negative rather than situational negative. But that's just me like thinking out loud.
This has been such a blast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And now we have books.
Now I have books. Come get them. I haven't answered all your questions.